Right now, in the quiet shelter of the evening, your mind may be drifting back to a conversation that ended hours, weeks, or even years ago. You might find yourself standing in the mental theater of what has already passed, repeating words you wish you had spoken, or replaying an action you wish you could pull back into your own hands. There is a specific heavy ache that arrives when you are alone with your thoughts at night. A feeling that if you just think about a past mistake one more time, you might somehow change the way it landed. It is an exhausting way to rest, carrying the silent weight of unexpressed feelings and unresolved choices, while the rest of the world is letting go of the day. Maybe you are listening to this because your heart feels crowded by those unspoken words, crowded by the phantom weight of what cannot be undone. As you lie here, let the sensory details of your immediate room settle around you like a cool mist. Notice the faint, cool air against the edge of your cheek and the deep, solid weight of the mattress holding your physical frame. You do not need to look at a clock, and you do not need to check for messages, because the world outside has slowed its pace. Listen for a moment to the distant, muted sounds of the night. Perhaps a passing car or the low hum of the house, recognizing that these sounds are simply moving through space without asking anything from you. Allow your eyelids to grow heavy, letting the dark behind your eyes become a vast, unmapped sky where no thoughts are required to shine. You are not fundamentally broken because your mind repeats these old memories, and this midnight restlessness is not a sign that you have failed. Tonight, we are not going to force your mind into a sudden artificial silence, nor will we demand that you magically repair every old misunderstanding before you are permitted to sleep. We are simply going to change the way you hold those memories. The mind does not find its true composure by waging a war against its own recollections, but by discovering a spaciousness where those recollections no longer have the power to wound. There is a strange paradox in human suffering that ancient wisdom understands deeply. We often believe that by continually replaying our past regrets, we are protecting ourselves from making the same mistake again, or we are somehow proving our own goodness through our willingness to suffer. But the truth is quite different. The mind does not heal a past wound by turning the memory into a weapon against the present self. Regret is often just fear wearing the mask of responsibility, a desperate attempt by the ego to control a reality that has already left the room. Think of how your body feels when a wave of memory hits you in the dark. Your jaw hardens, your shoulders pull slightly upward, and your fingers might curl into a faint, invisible grip. It is as if you are physically holding onto a thick, waterlogged hemp rope that is dragging behind a boat in a wide river. The rope has grown heavy, swollen from absorbing the cold river water, and it is caught on hidden rocks deep below the surface. Your hands are tired, your skin is raw from the friction, yet you keep pulling, believing that if you just pull hard enough, you can lift the entire riverbed into the air. But what if the riverbed does not need to be lifted? And what if the rope is only heavy because you refuse to open your palms? In a short while, we will explore an ancient story about a river fork that will show us an entirely different way to relate to these heavy hidden currents. For now, let your breath begin to find its own natural, unhurried cadence, without any pressure to breathe deeply or perfectly. Just notice the physical rising of your chest, a gentle movement that happens all on its own, and the slow falling release that follows. Each breath is an event that occurs strictly in the present moment, a soft reminder that your body is living here, right now, while your thoughts are wandering through a ghost world of yesterday. You can allow those thoughts to drift like dry leaves on the surface of a dark pond, watching them appear and watching them float past without needing to reach out and catch them. You do not have to solve the puzzle of your entire life tonight, and you do not need to find the perfect words to heal an old relationship before your head meets the pillow. Let the heavy net of your history rest where it is, deep in the dark water, untouched by the surface breeze. You are safe enough in this immediate darkness to let your white-knuckled grip soften, millimeter by millimeter, trusting that the night can hold you even when you choose to drop the weight. Long before our frantic worlds of glass and metal were built, there lived a young monastic named Jizang, who spent his nights wandering through the valleys because his mind would not permit him to sleep. His internal world was a restless landscape of memories, always returning to a specific evening where an old friend had asked for his help, and Jizang had turned away out of a narrow, prideful irritation. The words he had spoken during that brief encounter had hardened in his memory like dried concrete, and the words he had failed to say felt like stones blocking his breath. He had traveled far to escape the geography of that mistake. Yet no matter how many miles he walked, the conversation remained entirely intact within his head. He knew every inflection of the voice, every shift of the twilight shadows on the ground that day, and every bitter consequence that followed his refusal. He was an intelligent young man, capable of memorizing long passages of scripture, yet he was completely powerless against the silent loop that played behind his eyes whenever the lanterns were extinguished. Hearing that an old river ferryman named Master Daoxing lived at a wide, muddy fork in the lower valley, Jizang descended the mountain path during a late autumn twilight. The air was thick with the scent of damp river silt and rotting willow leaves, a heavy, wet cold that seemed to sink directly into the marrow of the bones. The river itself was a broad, slate-gray expanse that moved with a slow, deceptive power, swirling in dark eddies around the wooden piers of a solitary dock. There were no grand temples here, no golden statues, and no clouds of fragrant incense. There was only a low wooden hut, its roof covered in green moss, and a single, flat-bottomed wooden ferry boat rocking rhythmically against the logs. Jizang found the master sitting on a low stool by the water, his skin weathered by decades of sun and mist to the color of dark walnut, his large, ink-stained hands resting quietly on his knees. Master Daoxing did not offer a profound philosophical greeting, nor did he invite the young traveler to sit by a warm hearth. He simply looked out over the moving water, his breathing synchronized with the heavy, natural slap of the river against the hull of his boat. Jizang, desperate for relief from his own internal noise, stood in the damp grass and began to speak of his regret, explaining how the past felt like an anchor dragging him down into the dark mud. He detailed his mistakes, his unexpressed apologies, and the relentless replays that ruined his nights. The old ferryman listened without nodding, his face as unmoving as a carved stone face on a mountain cliff, his eyes tracking the slow movement of floating debris in the current. When Jizang finally ran out of words, the silence that returned to the riverbank felt vast, cold, and entirely indifferent to his human pain. Instead of offering words of comfort, Master Daoxing stood up slowly, his old joints making a dry, cracking sound that was immediately swallowed by the rush of the water. He stepped onto the wet deck of the ferry boat and pointed toward a thick, waterlogged hemp rope that disappeared over the stern into the dark depths of the river fork. He instructed Jizang to take hold of the rope and haul whatever was attached to it up into the boat, his voice low and raspy like two stones scraping together. Jizang, eager to prove his diligence and desperate for a practical lesson, stepped onto the rocking wood and gripped the wet fibers of the hemp. The rope was incredibly cold, dripping with foul-smelling river mud, and its twisted strands had swollen from absorbing the water for what must have been many years. As Jizang pulled, his boots slipped on the slimy wood, and a sharp strain shot through his lower back. The object at the other end of the line felt completely immovable, buried deep within the invisible currents of the riverbed. He wrapped the rough hemp around his palms, pulling with the entirety of his physical weight, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps that turned to white mist in the twilight air. Millimeter by millimeter, the swollen rope emerged from the water, covered in tangled river weeds, dead reeds, and pockets of black silt that splattered against his clean robes. His hands grew raw, the skin turning bright red and white from the intense friction and the biting cold of the river water. Yet, despite his straining muscles and his burning lungs, the main weight remained anchored in the hidden depths, refusing to rise to the surface. Jizang stopped to catch his breath, his hands shaking violently as he looked down at the dark, swirling water where the rope disappeared. He told the master that the task was impossible, that the net at the bottom was clearly caught on the massive hidden rocks of the river fork, and that no single man could ever lift the riverbed into the air. Master Daoxing walked over, his footsteps silent on the wet planks, and stood right next to the sweating young monastic. He did not help Jizang pull. Nor did he give him advice on his posture or his technique. He simply reached out with his rough hand and tapped the white-knuckled fingers that were still clutched around the muddy hemp, his touch surprisingly light yet firm. The old ferryman asked Jizang why he was working so hard to pull up something that belonged to the bottom of the river. He asked if the net was holding on to Jizang, or if Jizang was the one choosing to hold on to the net in that single, quiet moment. The scraping sound of the water against the hull seemed to grow louder, filling the entire space between the riverbanks. Jizang looked down at his own bleeding fingers, feeling the cold slime of the hemp oozing between his knuckles, and a sudden sharp clarity pierced through his exhaustion. He realized that the master had not given him a task to complete, but a mirror to look into. The immense weight he had been fighting for the past hour did not exist because the river was hostile, but because his own hands refused to let the rope slide back into the deep. A profound, heavy stillness descended upon the young man as he stood on the rocking ferry under the purple twilight sky. He looked at the old ferryman, then down at the waterlogged line, and slowly, finger by finger, he began to uncurl his grip. The hemp rope, no longer held by his human will, slid quickly over the wooden edge of the boat, making a wet rushing sound as it plunged back into the dark current. It sank instantly, disappearing beneath the gray surface without a trace, leaving only a few bubbles and a patch of disturbed mud that was quickly washed away by the moving river. Jizang stood with his empty palms open to the night air, his hands stinging from the raw skin. Yet his chest felt lighter than it had in many years. The river continued to flow, the boat continued to rock, and the dark water kept moving toward the distant ocean, completely unburdened by what had just been dropped into its depths. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter about the nature of our own internal weight. Jizang looked at his empty hands, noticing how the cold wind felt against his raw skin, a sharp, clean sensation that belonged entirely to the present moment. The phantom weight of his past conversation was still there in his memory, but the frantic, straining need to pull it up, to inspect the damage, and to clean the mud from it had vanished with the rope. He turned to Master Daosheng, expecting a final word of validation, or an explanation of the truth he had just discovered. But the old ferryman had already turned his back, walking slowly toward his low wooden hut to light a single dim paper lantern against the gathering darkness of the valley. This old story of the swollen, heavy rope is not an instruction to erase your past or to freeze your human feelings into a cold, unyielding winter ground. It does not ask you to pretend that the words that hurt you never happened, or that your own mistakes did not leave an imprint on your life. Real wisdom never requires you to become a stone figure sitting on a riverbank, untouched by the natural grief of a lost connection or an unfulfilled longing. The Buddha was not pointing toward a state of emotional numbness, where nothing matters and no one is loved. He was showing us an entirely different way to perceive the movement of our own memories, a way that preserves our deep humanity while protecting our hearts from self-inflicted wounds. When we look into the deep, quiet architecture of our suffering, we discover that the initial pain of an event is very different from the chronic ache that keeps us awake at midnight. There is the initial event itself, a conversation that went wrong, an unexpected rejection, or a moment where our actions fell short of our own ideals. This is the first ripple in the water, a clean, sharp discomfort that forms a natural part of living in an unpredictable world. But then, hours or years later, the mind begins its long, exhausting work of creating the secondary weight. We throw ourselves over the edge of our own peace, grasping a thick cord of mental replays, pulling the old mud back up into our current awareness over and over again. The primary distress has already left the physical room, yet we continue to manufacture an ongoing internal crisis by refusing to let the rope slide through our fingers. We mistakenly believe that our intense mental labor is a form of correction, as if the sheer force of our worry could somehow rewrite the ancient history resting on the riverbed. This is what ancient traditions mean when they speak of attachment. It is not the presence of a memory that causes our exhaustion, but the desperate, white-knuckled insistence that the memory must be different before we are allowed to rest. It is the tight, suffocating feeling that our worth as a person is permanently tied to an unchangeable yesterday. forcing us to carry a waterlogged burden that grows heavier with every passing mile. Consider how much energy it takes to maintain this silent struggle while you are trying to sleep. The mind stays hypervigilant, acting as both the prosecutor and the accused, reviewing every syllable spoken, analyzing every shift in another person's expression. This is craving in its most subtle, agonizing form, a persistent thirst for a different past, a structural resistance to the reality that has already occurred. We turn our own awareness into a battleground, believing that if we stop analyzing the mistake for even an hour, we are somehow condoning it or proving that we do not care. But letting go is never an act of abandonment or indifference. It is simply the profound, intuitive realization that the weight you are dragging is completely separate from the life you are living right now. True mindfulness is nothing more than the gentle capacity to see the swollen rope without automatically wrapping it around your hands. It is the soft space that opens within your consciousness when you notice a regretful thought rising to the surface, and instead of pulling on it, you choose to simply observe its texture. You see the mud, you recognize the cold water of the memory, and you allow it to exist without allowing it to dominate your breath. You become the wide, steady river itself rather than the exhausted traveler trying to clear the rocks by hand. The river does not fight the debris that drops into its current, nor does it try to hold onto a beautiful autumn leaf that floats along its surface. It simply provides the space for all things to move, allowing the mud to settle naturally to the bottom, while the surface remains clear, open, and responsive to the sky. This understanding shifts our entire relationship with self-forgiveness, transforming it from a difficult psychological chore into an act of deep spiritual compassion. Compassion is not a soft sentimentality that ignores our past failures, but the immense, quiet strength to meet our own suffering without using our memories as weapons against our own skin. When you understand that your mind began replaying those old conversations out of a primitive desire to feel safe, you can stop punishing yourself for overthinking. You can look at your own tired consciousness with a sense of gentle perspective, recognizing that the extra weight you have been carrying was just fear trying to protect you in the only way it knew how. Slowly, this subtle teaching begins to come closer to your own immediate night, moving from an ancient story into the physical reality of your body lying in this room. You begin to see that the heavy net of your history does not have an inherent power to keep you awake, because its weight only exists when you choose to lift it into the present moment. The words left unsaid, the paths not taken, the small failures of courage or kindness, they are all events that have already dissolved into the vast distance of time. They have no physical presence in this room, no voice to speak unless you lend them your own breath, and no power to bind you unless you continue to clamp your hands around the wet line. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter about how this insight transforms our daily lives when we stop fighting the current. We can begin to acknowledge the sheer exhaustion of our old habits, recognizing that our white-knuckled grip has not repaired a single past mistake, nor has it brought a single distant person closer to our heart. It has only left our palms raw, our minds crowded, and our nights depleted of the natural rest that belongs to us. You do not need to perform a grand act of willpower to change this pattern tonight, because real freedom does not arrive with a loud crash or a sudden explosion of light. It comes in the quiet spaces between your thoughts, in the soft realization that your hands are already your own, and that the river has always been deep enough to receive what you are ready to let fall. Now, let us bring this ancient understanding directly into the quiet geography of your own body, right here where you lie. There is no need to make a grand gesture, and no one is asking you to forcefully alter the pattern of your thoughts tonight. Real transformation does not require you to conquer your mind, but simply to change where you place your attention within the quietness of this room. If it feels right, allow your shoulders to sink just a fraction deeper into the support of your bed, noticing the natural weight of your frame as it presses down. You might feel a subtle tension lingering in the small muscles around your eyes, or perhaps a slight tightness in your jaw, where you have been holding the unsaid words of the day. You can just let those areas soften, not by commanding them to relax, but by simply bringing a warm, unhurried awareness to where the tension lives. Take a slow, natural breath in, letting the cool night air fill the lower spaces of your chest without any straining or rushing. And as you let that breath slip away, notice how the body naturally knows how to empty itself without you needing to direct the process. You do not have to manage the air, just as you do not have to manage the entire history of your life in this single moment. Perhaps as you rest here, a specific memory or an old conversation will try to drift back into your awareness, pulling at your attention like that wet hemp line in the current. If that happens, you do not need to push the thought away, and you certainly do not need to scold yourself for overthinking. Even noticing that your mind has wandered is a beautiful, gentle form of wisdom. It means you are no longer lost in the mist, but are standing on the bank, watching the water move. As you observe that persistent thought, try to name the emotional pattern behind it, speaking to yourself with the absolute kindness of an old friend. You might say to yourself quietly that this is just regret trying to fix what is already past, or that this is simply fear wanting to rewrite an old script to feel safer tonight. When you label the pattern instead of fighting the story, the tight grip around your heart begins to loosen just a little bit. You might imagine that very thought, with all its sharp edges, its heavy questions, and its unresolved sentences, being placed gently into the wet strands of the swollen hemp net we encountered by the river fork. See the thought resting there, among the tangled reeds and the dark river silt, completely separate from the living, breathing skin of your palms. Let the image change slightly in your mind eye, allowing yourself to visualize your own hands slowly, deliberately opening under the dark sky. There is no sudden snap, and no dramatic effort is required to let go. Perhaps you can just let the heavy cord slide through your fingers, millimeter by millimeter, feeling the rough texture of the hemp pass across your skin without trying to catch it or pull it back. Watch the rope dip below the gray surface of the water, moving away from your immediate life, descending into the soft mud of the riverbed where it can no longer drain your strength. You are not erasing the past by doing this, but you are choosing to stop lifting it into the clean, quiet air of your bedroom tonight. You can return to your ordinary breath whenever you are ready, letting the rhythmic rising and falling of your chest become your primary anchor in the darkness. There is no pressure to achieve a state of perfect, blissful enlightenment before your head settles deeper into the pillow, because even a small moment of softening is entirely enough. If your mind returns to the old loop 100 times tonight, your only task is to gently, without any judgment, open your hands 100 times, letting the river receive what you cannot change. You do not have to heal every old wound or solve the puzzle of your entire existence in these dark hours. For now, it is safe enough to let the world carry itself, while you allow your weary consciousness to rest in the spacious stillness that remains when the weight is dropped. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter, as we journey deeper into the mountain forests, where an old nun tends a quiet orchard under the late autumn stars. But right now, let your awareness settle completely into the physical sensations of this present moment, feeling the cool air against your skin and the deep, reliable gravity of the earth beneath your bed. Nothing is required of you, nothing is chasing you, and there are no words left that must be spoken before you are allowed to sleep. You can simply exist here, a quiet witness to the steady movement of your own breath, knowing that the spacious sky of your awareness is completely unblemished by the passing clouds of yesterday. The release Jizang felt at the edge of the river fork was a profound arrival, yet the human mind does not surrender its oldest defenses in a single evening. As the weeks marched onward and the late autumn mist began to freeze into the sharp air of early winter, the young monastic found that his thoughts were constructing a new version of the old prison. He no longer felt the immediate, violent pulling of the heavy river net, but a quieter, more insidious habit took its place in the dark. When the mountain winds howled against his small shelter, his mind would quietly return to the ancient workspace of his regret, turning the old conversation over and over like a traveler examining a jagged coin. He was no longer trying to pull the past out of the water, but he was still trying to polish it, trying to smooth out the rough edges of his old choices through sheer mental friction. His nights remained fractured, his sleep interrupted by the subtle, persistent grinding of his own intellect against an unchangeable reality. Seeking a deeper resolution, Jizang climbed into the higher ridges of the northern peaks, where an elderly nun named Sister Tsuniko lived alone in a drafty, unpainted wooden shed attached to a remote mountain granary. The setting was stark, stripped of all comfort by the approaching winter, and the ground was covered with the fallen leaves of a sprawling orchard of bitter persimmons. Sister Tsuneko was a woman of immense silence, walking with a slight, rhythmic limp that echoed softly across the frozen dirt yards. She did not teach by chanting grand sutras or by offering gentle promises of immediate healing. When Jizang arrived, his face tight with renewed exhaustion, she merely glanced at his ink-stained robes and his troubled eyes, then pointed him toward the cold interior of the granary shed. Inside the shed, the air smelled of dry grain dust, cold iron, and the sharp, slightly fermented scent of the winter orchard outside. The old nun reached into a wooden bin and brought out a large, flat sharpening stone, its dark gray surface coarse and pitted from decades of heavy use. She placed it on a low bench before Jizang, and then she handed him a single thick iron needle that had grown completely dull and encrusted with dark red rust. Her instructions were brief, delivered in a voice that carried the crisp neutrality of the mountain wind. She told him to sit on the cold earth and grind the rusted iron needle against the stone until it was entirely transformed, without stopping to rest until the metal changed its nature. Jizang sat down, his knees pressing into the hard dirt floor, and he began the heavy, repetitive motion. He pressed the rusted iron needle firmly against the coarse surface of the sharpening stone, sliding it forward and backward with a steady, determined force. A harsh, scraping sound filled the small wooden shed, a rhythmic, piercing noise that seemed to vibrate directly through the bones of his wrists and up into his shoulders. Within minutes, his fingers were coated in a fine, greasy layer of gray dust, mixed with the orange flakes of the dislodged rust. The cold air in the drafty room made his knuckles ache, and the skin of his palms began to throb from the constant, unyielding pressure against the iron. For hours, the young monk labored in the dim light of the granary, his mind focusing entirely on the mechanical task. He watched the gray dust accumulate on his skin, watching the tiny particles pile up on the edges of the stone like a tiny mound of dark sand. He believed that this discipline was the path to his purification, that by grinding the metal so intensely, he was somehow burning away the stubborn impurities of his own restless spirit. He thought of his past mistakes with every forward stroke, matching the harsh scraping sound of the metal to the internal accusations that still lingered in his heart. He poured his frustration, his grief, and his longing for self-forgiveness into the stone, expecting that a sudden moment of miraculous clarity would soon illuminate the room. But as the afternoon began to fade into a dull purple-gray twilight, the needle did not become a brilliant, perfect instrument of light. It simply grew slightly thinner, its surface remaining dark and cold, while the sharpening stone itself began to show a shallow, worn groove from his frantic labor. Jizang stopped his hand, his muscles trembling with a profound, deep-seated fatigue that went far beyond physical tiredness. He looked down at his fingers, which were completely blackened by the gray metal dust, and he felt a familiar heavy despair settling into his stomach. He looked at Sister Tsuniko, who was standing quietly near the open doorway of the shed, watching the mist gather in the persimmon trees outside. He told her that his work was yielding nothing but dust, that his hands were ruined, and that the iron remained just as stubborn and unyielding as it had been when the sun rose. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter about the way the mind tries to heal its old wounds. Sister Tsuniko did not offer to help him grind, nor did she tell him that his effort was a failure. Instead, she walked over with her slow, limping gait and picked up one of the fallen persimmons from a basket near the door, its skin tight and frosty from the winter air. She peeled a small strip of the bitter skin with her thumbnail and offered it to Jizang, telling him to taste the fruit before he spoke another word about his work. Jizang took the piece, placing it on his tongue, and his mouth was instantly filled with a sharp, astringent bitterness that made his throat tighten. It was not sweet, it was not pleasant, and it did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. The old nun looked down at the gray dust coating the young man's hands, and she asked him a question that altered the entire direction of his journey. She asked him if he believed that by wearing away his own fingers, he could ever turn the winter fruit into summer honey. She asked him to look closely at what he was actually destroying through his relentless grinding. Jizang looked down at the stone, then at his blackened skin, and a wave of silent recognition washed over his tired mind. He realized that the iron needle was his memory of the past, a hard, unyielding fact that had already been cast in the furnace of time. His constant mental replaying, his endless analysis, and his nighttime rehearsals were not changing the shape of what had happened. They were simply grinding away his own living present, leaving nothing but gray dust in his hands. The transformation that came over Jizang in that drafty mountain granary was not a sudden explosion of joy, but a quiet, dignified surrender to the truth of reality. He did not magically forget his old friend, nor did he pretend that his past choices had been perfect. Instead, he simply stopped the active, exhausting motion of his arm. He laid the iron needle down on the flat stone, allowing it to rest there in its imperfect, blunt condition, without needing to polish it for another second. He took a long, slow breath of the cold winter air, feeling the sharp expansion of his lungs, and he walked over to a basin of water in the corner of the room to wash the gray dust from his skin. As the clean water turned dark with the metal residue, Jizang felt a profound, unclutched peace settling into the marrow of his bones. He had spent years believing that his suffering was a necessary punishment, a debt he had to pay by continually replaying his failures in the theater of his mind. But now, watching the gray silt settle to the bottom of the wooden wash basin, he saw the absolute futility of his defense. He could live with the blunt reality of his history, without needing to grind his life away to change it. He stepped back out into the orchard with the old nun, the frozen ground firm beneath his sandals, and he looked up at the first winter stars appearing through the purple mist, his heart finally quiet enough to hear the wind moving through the barren branches. When we watch the gray silt settle to the bottom of the wash basin, we are looking at the exact mechanism of our own internal exhaustion. The mind has a deeply ingrained habit of turning its past mistakes into a permanent identity, believing that if we stop punishing ourselves, we are somehow letting ourselves off the hook. We become like the young monastic, sitting on the cold floor of our own thoughts, grinding the unyielding iron of yesterday against the rough stone of our present awareness. We do not realize that the heavy layer of gray dust coating our lives is not the fault of the past event itself. It is the direct result of the relentless internal friction we create when we refuse to accept what has already occurred. We treat our self-judgment as a form of hidden discipline, hoping that if we suffer enough through our late-night replays, we will somehow earn our way back to peace. This is the great psychological trap that ancient Buddhist wisdom exposes with such profound tenderness. There is a vital distinction between the natural pain that life brings and the secondary suffering that our own minds manufacture in the dark. The first discomfort is simply the reality of what happened, a conversation that ended badly, a choice that left a scar, or a word that can never be recalled. This is the hard, cold iron core of the needle, or the inherently bitter skin of the winter fruit. It is an unalterable fact of your history, existing as a fixed point in the distance behind you. It contains its own quiet ache, but that raw ache is bounded by time and space, and it does not have the inherent power to destroy your evening. The secondary suffering is the exhausting work that begins when you lie awake, insisting that the iron should be gold, or that the bitter fruit should taste sweet. This extra agony is entirely created by your internal resistance, by the frantic movement of your thoughts, trying to force an unyielding memory to take a different shape. You review the dialogue, you rehearse better endings, and you blame your own character for not knowing then what you know now. This is the mind attempting to exercise control over an empty room where the fire has already gone out. We layer shame on top of our original regret, turning a single past mistake into a definition of who we are today. And this secondary friction is what truly drains our spirit. Peace does not arrive because you have successfully traveled backward in time and polished away every clumsy phrase or broken promise from your youth. It arrives when you stop treating the blunt iron of your history as an enemy that must be destroyed before you are permitted to sleep. The Buddha pointed toward a freedom that does not require a pristine, flawless past, but a spacious, compassionate relationship with the past you actually have. When you stop grinding the needle, the harsh scraping sound in your head naturally begins to subside. The gray dust of your anxiety stops rising into the air, and you are left with the simple, clean reality of the present moment, which is always completely untouched by the errors of yesterday. Slowly, this ancient understanding begins to move out of the mountain granary and into the silent space of your own life. Think of how many nights you have spent acting as both the harsh judge and the helpless prisoner within your own mind. You replay an old social interaction, analyzing the tone of a voice, or wondering what the other person thinks of you now, believing that this mental labor is protecting you from future rejection. But this is just fear wearing the elaborate costume of caution, an illusion that safety can be found by mapping every phantom current in the river. The mind craves certainty, and when it cannot control the outer world, it turns inward to terrorize itself with its own recollections. Every time you repeat a regretful memory, you are not fixing the past. You are merely reinforcing the habit of distress within your physical body. Your chest tightens, your breathing becomes shallow, and you stay locked in a defensive posture while your bed is offering you nothing but total support. You are treating a conceptual ghost as an immediate physical threat, forcing your nervous system to fight a war that ended years ago. Buddhist insight invites you to see this process clearly, not to judge yourself for doing it, but to recognize the immense futility of the struggle. The thought of your mistake is not the mistake itself. It is just a current passing through your awareness, and you possess the quiet authority to let it move past without grabbing the rope. You can allow your past to remain imperfect without needing to turn your present mind into a torture chamber to pay for it. Forgiveness is not a magical erase button that changes the flavor of the bitter persimmon, but the elegant choice to stop trying to force the winter branch to bloom out of season. It is the realization that you did the best you could with the level of awareness you possessed at that particular intersection of your life. To demand that your past self act with the wisdom of your present self is a cruel contradiction, a form of internal violence that only prolongs the heavy winter of the heart. You can set the grinding stone down now, because the floor is already clean, and the night has no interest in your gray dust. In a moment, we will look at how this subtle shift transforms the small, chaotic movements of your everyday world when the sun rises tomorrow. But right now, let the absolute uselessness of your midnight worry wash over you like a cool, clearing rain. Recognize that all your analysis has not altered a single syllable of what has been spoken, and it never will. You do not need to carry the weight of your entire biography into the next hour, because your biography is just a collection of old nets resting on a distant riverbed. You are the deep, unmoving space through which the water flows, a space that remains wide, safe, and entirely whole, even when the currents below are carrying the remnants of an old storm. Now let this wisdom come closer to your own life, moving from the quiet, freezing stillness of the mountain orchard into the loud, chaotic spaces of your modern afternoons. We do not live our lives in unpainted wooden granaries or on remote ferry boats, and our daily weights do not look like muddy hemp ropes dipped in a flowing river. Instead, our burdens are often hidden inside the sleek, plastic shells of our digital screens, or carried quietly within the small, ordinary interactions of our workplaces. You know this friction intimately, because you have felt its heat during those long minutes spent staring at a blank chat window, waiting for a specific text response that never seems to arrive. Your mind immediately begins its frantic, habitual grinding, manufacturing a dozen different explanations for the silence, analyzing the punctuation of the last message, and rehearsing what you should have written instead. In those small, intense moments of anticipation, you are doing nothing other than gripping the cold, swollen line of an unchangeable seconds-old past. You are insisting that the reality of the present moment must conform to your immediate desire for validation, turning a simple delay into a vast, terrifying verdict on your personal worth. The phone becomes a heavy, sharpening stone, and your attention rubs against its surface until your thoughts are completely covered in the dark dust of anxiety. But what happens if you simply pause for the duration of one single breath before you check the screen for the 20th time? What happens if you recognize that the silence on the other end is just a natural current in the day, containing no inherent commentary on who you are as a human being? Have you ever noticed how often you smile at a colleague or a family member, while your chest is feeling incredibly heavy with the unspoken exhaustion of pretending to be perfectly fine? We walk through our modern offices and our crowded grocery stores wearing an elaborate mask of competence, terrified that if we show even a single fracture in our composure, we will be judged as weak or left behind. We see our peers sharing their highlight reels, their milestones, and their victories on social media, and a quiet panic settles into our bones, telling us that we are failing an invisible race. We believe we must constantly produce, constantly improve, and constantly fix our flaws until even the act of sitting down on a sofa feels like an act of dangerous negligence. This is the subtle violence of modern life, a relentless insistence that rest is a luxury you must earn through total exhaustion, rather than a natural right that belongs to your body. When you lie down at the end of a long day, a small, bitter voice inside your head often tells you that you have not done enough to deserve a quiet night. It lists the tasks left unfinished, the emails left unanswered, and the social interactions that could have been handled with more grace. You feel an intense, chronic guilt for simply wanting to close your eyes, as if your value as a living creature is tied strictly to the number of achievements you can display before the sun goes down. But Buddhist wisdom reminds us that you do not need to validate your existence by grinding your life into dust for a world that is never truly satisfied. True discipline is not the practice of hating yourself until you become perfect, but the soft, courageous choice to allow your weary mind to step off the track. When you feel the familiar urge to overanalyze a minor conversational mistake you made 3 hours ago, you can gently choose not to obey that internal command. You can notice the thought rising, recognize its dry, scraping texture, and simply say to yourself that you are no longer running that particular engine tonight. You can care deeply about the people in your life without holding on to their moods so tightly that you suffocate your own internal peace. This is how we practice letting go in the middle of our ordinary, messy days. Not by escaping our responsibilities, but by changing our internal posture toward them. It is found in the 3 seconds of silence you give yourself before responding to an irritating comment from a supervisor or a partner. It is practiced when you consciously relax your shoulders while standing in a long line at the bank, or when you choose to leave your phone in another room so your mind can taste the unhurried flavor of your dinner. These are not grand, dramatic spiritual achievements, yet they are the exact moments where the heavy rope of your history is allowed to slide back into the water where it belongs. Think of how much lighter your afternoons would feel if you stopped treating every anxious thought as an absolute, undeniable truth about reality. A thought is not a command that you must follow, nor is it a permanent fixture of your identity. It is simply a tiny, transient ripple on the surface of your awareness. A brief event that arises, lingers for a few moments, and dissolves all on its own if you do not feed it with your attention. You do not have to fight the thought, and you do not have to clean the mud from it, because you can simply let it float past like a winter leaf moving down a dark stream. You can live with the blunt, imperfect edges of your daily life, knowing that your essential wholeness has never been dependent on a flawless performance. Tomorrow, when you step back into the noise of your commitments, the old habits of overthinking and self-punishment will undoubtedly try to catch your attention again. You might find yourself replaying a meeting, or feeling that heavy, familiar longing to undo an action that did not land well. But tomorrow, you will carry the quiet memory of the river fork and the mountain granary within the deep spaces of your heart. You will know that the immense weight you are feeling is never the fault of the world outside, but the result of your own hands trying to change what has already left the room. You can take a slow, unhurried breath in the middle of the chaos, remembering that your hands are entirely your own, and that you possess the quiet authority to open your palms at any hour of the day. The room has grown completely still now, and the heavy demands of the daylight hours have finally receded into the shadows of the evening. The wide river we visualized earlier continues its slow, unhurried journey through the valley, entirely untroubled by the depth of the water or the debris resting on its floor. Down in those quiet depths, the waterlogged hemp rope has settled into the soft, dark mud of the riverbed, motionless and undisturbed by the cold currents moving across its fibers. The tangled reeds have drifted away, the black silt has drifted away, and the surface of the water has become a smooth, unblemished sheet of glass, reflecting the vast silence of the night sky. There is no longer any pulling, there is no longer any straining, and there is no longer any human hand working in the dark to change what has already been washed away. Allow your physical frame to sink completely into the dark safety of your bed, feeling your muscles give up their last remaining defenses against gravity. Your shoulders are heavy, your jaw has softened, and the skin around your temples has become completely smooth, like the water after a long winter storm has passed. Your breath has found its own internal rhythm, a quiet, gentle rising and falling that requires no management, no effort, and no conscious direction from your tired mind. With each slow, emptying exhale, imagine that you are simply letting the last remnants of the day's gray dust dissolve into the dark air of the room. You have laid the heavy iron needle down on the stone. You have washed your hands in the clean basin, and there is absolutely nothing left that needs to be polished before the morning arrives. Let your awareness drift away from the world of words, away from the complicated loops of past conversations and the exhausting pressure of unresolved questions. The people you were trying to fix, the choices you were trying to rewrite, and the unsaid apologies that crowded your heart are all allowed to rest exactly as they are in this immediate darkness. The past has no voice to speak in this room, no power to tighten your chest, and no authority to demand your attention while the world is sleeping. You are no longer the frantic traveler trying to clear the riverbed by hand, but the wide, steady expanse of the river itself, which simply allows all currents to move through its space without holding on to a single drop. Your mind can finally stop its long vigil, letting the need for safety through control dissolve into the deep, supportive stillness of the mattress beneath you. You are permitted to be imperfect tonight. You are permitted to leave the stories unfinished, and you are permitted to drop the heavy net of your history into the dark water without tracking where it lands. The darkness behind your closed eyes is a vast open sanctuary, a home that has never been damaged by your mistakes and has never been diminished by your silence. You do not need to figure out your life before your eyelids close, because the night is vast enough to hold your uncertainty without asking for a single answer. Listen to the absolute quietness that remains when you choose to stop fighting your own memories, a peace that was never ahead of you in the future, but has always been breathing softly right beneath the struggle. The air is cool, the room is secure, and your body is completely safe to surrender its weight to the deep, unhurried dark. Let the rhythm of your breathing become slower, softer, and more distant, a faint ripple on a deep pond that is gradually settling into perfect glassy stillness under the stars. Nothing is chasing you, nothing is waiting to be solved, and you have finally returned to the quiet center of your own heart. And if the deep forgiveness you have been searching for all these years was never about fixing the words you spoke back then, but about finally opening your hands to the silence that is holding you right now,